Hi, I'm Phil Craig.
And I'm Andrew Lownie.
And together we aim to bring you the most scandalous stories and some of the most scandalous people in history. So thanks for joining us here on the Scandal Mongers podcast. Good day, Andrew.
Good day to you across the oceans. This is an international podcast.
It is. I have to start by thanking Andrew. I'm here in Australia, and I made him get up really, really early. I don't think the butler has even been yet. Has he
No.
laid out your slippers? Has he ironed your copy of the Times?
Well, I almost thought of coming in the sort of my pajamas, but there are standards to be upheld.
There are standards to be upheld. You're quite right. Actually, do you know what? I want to start by reading you some of our latest reviews. I think this is my favourite part of doing the podcast. People are now writing in to say what they're doing while they're listening to us.
Right.
So Catherine from Oxfordshire says, it's my new favourite thing to listen to whilst doing the ironing. Very relaxing.
Great. Well, I mean, I think that's it's a good way of making a boring job more interesting.
I agree. And so let us know what you're doing while you're listening to Andrew and I droning on. But actually, this is my favourite. Jane Carrow, our friend, very much a friend of this podcast, a writer and broadcaster from Australia, says, I love this podcast. It's a subversive view of history, which debunks myths and pulls down the pants of the posh and the powerful.
Well, yes, that should be on my obituary.
So whose pants are we pulling down today, Andrew?
Well, it's a mystery. It's one of the great unexplained mysteries. The files are closed now until 2057, 100 years after it happened. It's been the subject of a very successful other podcast here in Britain. It's a subject I know a little bit about because it touches on Mountbatten. And what I'm hoping is we're going to be able to probe and get a little bit more than is in the other podcast, which is a sort of 8-part series.
So we're doing a podcast on a podcast?
Well, we'll do a podcast on the mysterious disappearance of Commander Lionel Buster Crabb, who was a diver who vanished doing it on a spying operation. But I think it fits into our theme well because it's also the story of a cover-up. And though it was pretty embarrassing that the British should be spying on the Russians, I think what is fascinating for us, particularly because of this concern about the cultural secrecy, is that the government have basically, from day one, have tried to shut the story down. And one has to ask, why have they done that?
So what do I need to know to get the best out of our upcoming interview?
Well, we need to know the basic story of why Commander Crabb was there, the historical context. It's the Cold War. This is a visit from Khrushchev and Bulgaria to Britain. And I think also there are lots of different theories about what happened to Crabb, who disappeared on that day, and some very plausible ones. I mean, it's very difficult to know where truth begins and the myths have begun to emerge. And I think what's clever about this podcast, his, Giles Milton's, is that he explores all the different options and either discredits them or thinks that they have some validity. And it's a very interesting aspect of what we as historians do, having to sort of probe stories to see if they stand up or not. And again, the mystery of history, because there are several very plausible things that could have happened to Crabb, but only one actually did happen.
Sounds absolutely riveting. Should we get to it?
Yes, let's get there.
Let's get there. So introducing Giles Milton in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So
I'm delighted to have Giles Milton talking about, I think, one of the great unexplained mysteries of the 20th century, which has been a very successful podcast. And I wonder, Giles, if you could tell us what the story really is about.
The story is about a celebrated wartime diver called Lionel Buster Crabb, who'd had all sorts of fabulous adventures in the war, great tales of heroism. He was a celebrated figure in Britain post-war. He'd been highly decorated, been given the George Medal. And then one day in April 1956, Lionel Crabb goes on a diving mission in Portsmouth Harbour and is never seen again. And this is a huge, well, not only is it a great mystery, but it develops into a great nationwide scandal. What has happened to Lionel Buster Crabb? No one knows. And the mystery spawns dozens of conspiracy theories, some plausible, some less plausible. And really, I think the reason why these conspiracy theories spin out of control is that when this story comes to the House of Commons, it's that big a story, you know, everyone's covering it, it's front page news, that when it comes to the House of Commons and the Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, is asked to explain what on earth has happened to this incredibly famous wartime hero, he says it would not be in the public interest to disclose the circumstances in which Commander Crabb is presumed to have met his death. This, of course, does not answer any of the questions that people are answering, and this is really the starting point for this extraordinary mystery that remains a mystery to this day. And of course, the crucial file that reveals the truth of what happened to Buster Crabb will not be released by the public by the government into the public domain until 2057. So
how wonderful!
We have an enduring mystery.
Well, Andrew knows a lot about files that people aren't allowed to see. I think that's for sure. So it's not really the story of a scandal, is it, then, Giles? It's the story of a cover-up of something which, if it were known, might have been or still would be a scandal.
Yeah, I think you know, in any void, in any vacuum, you'll get people trying to fill it with theories, and I think the press were incredibly frustrated at the time that no one would give them any answers from the Prime Minister downwards, and so they began to speculate. And you know, any little bit of snippet of gossip that sounded half plausible, they would put onto the front page of the newspapers. They also had a number of you know, so-called eyewitnesses or people who'd been involved in the Crabb disappearance, who started popping up and telling their stories, and it's very difficult to know how plausible, how true these stories are, how credible these witnesses are, and that's what one of the things we tried to do in the podcast was to really go through all these individual theories, which, as I say, some were very plausible, and find out if there was any shred of truth to them.
Well, what are the theories? Sorry, what are the theories? Because I mean, the talk of him defecting, of being captured, of being shot at the time, of just being captured and then dying as he's being interrogated. I mean, as you investigated them, which sounded more plausible than others?
Well, I think the most plausible one, and one that was certainly believed by his closest friends, his diving buddy even, Sidney Knowles, and also by his family, is one of two theories. One that is he defected to the Soviet Union, and the other is that he was captured by the KGB. Because I suppose we ought to just set the background to this diving mission. This is April 1956, and a big historic event is about to take place in Portsmouth, and that is the arrival of Khrushchev and Bulganin. So the head of the two most important players in the Soviet Union are coming on an unprecedented Cold War visit to Great Britain. This really is a big event, and it is absolutely vital for the government of the day that nothing goes wrong on this visit. You know, this is Anthony Eden rolling out the red carpet. He wants the complete reset of relations between Great Britain and the Soviet Union. He wants to be a bridge, if you like, between the Soviet Union and the United States. He sees this as an opportunity, really, for Britain to get back its place on the world stage. So it's a very, artfully managed visit. The two Soviet warships come into Portsmouth Harbour, they dock there, and Khrushchev and Bulganin step down into the harbour and then are taken off to London, where they meet Anthony Eden, they meet the Queen, they're given the absolute sort of red carpet treatment. So it's important that nothing goes wrong whatsoever. So when this incredibly celebrated diver disappears in Portsmouth Harbour at exactly the time when these two Soviet warships are there anchored in the harbour, people begin to think, put two and two together and think something fishy might be going on here, and so that really explains the background as to how these two theories that he defected to the Soviet Union, always captured by KGB agents on board Khrushchev's vessel, they came into play. And so those were two of the key theories that we followed throughout the course of the podcast.
How did you research it? I mean, was there new material? Were there new people you spoke to who hadn't spoken before?
Yeah, we had a very good old friend of mine, Russian friend of mine, Masha, who really helped with our research in Russia. And we knew of the existence of a video interview with a so-called former KGB agent who claimed to have killed Lionel Crabb underwater. He dived into, he knew that Crabb was doing something fishy underneath the Khrushchev's vessel. He was sent into the water and he knifed him, cut his throat, slit his throat open and killed him in the water. We knew of the existence of this, and actually Marsha rather brilliantly managed to lay her hands on this video. So we had this interview with him. And then we had to work out, well, hold on a minute, is this guy actually telling the truth or not? And this is the problem, or one of the great colourful sort of things about the story of Lionel Crabb, is there are all these stories, and you have to work out, are they actually true? You know, because often in cases like this, big celebrity sort of mysteries and everything, you get people jumping on the bandwagon and telling stories that, in fact, they've completely invented. So this chap, Edward Koltsov, he was called, we had to work out if this story was plausible or not. And that forms one of the episodes in the podcast. But then there's the other theory, which was put about by Sidney Knowles, which was Lionel Crabb's diving buddy, who knew Lionel Crabb better than anyone in the world. You know, these two had fought the Second World War together. They'd done everything together. So they were really were very, very close friends. He claimed that Lionel Crabb had defected to the Soviet Union, that he was a communist sympathizer, always had been, that he was linked to all the Cambridge spies, he was very closely linked to Anthony Blunt, and that he defected. So that was another strand to be investigated.
But I mean, a body was found 14 months later, but with the head and the hands cut off, which is rather mysterious. And then there was some speculation about whether this really was Crabb because they weren't identifying scars and things. I mean, what's your take on that?
So this was I mean, this comes towards the end of the podcast, and it's an absolutely fascinating story. You're right. Sort of 14 months later, after Crabb's disappearance, a body is washed up, and it's like you say, it's headless and handless. Now, we're talking 1957 here. This is long before DNA profiling and everything. The only certain way to identify a body back then was by the teeth or by the fingerprints. So if you want to dispose of somebody incognito, as it were, you remove the head and you remove the hands, and it's almost impossible to identify that corpse. So we have this this headless, handless corpse, which is fished out of Chichester Harbour, not Portsmouth Harbour, Chichester Harbour, so down the coast, 10 miles down the coast. A fisherman, they're trawling for fish in Chichester Harbour, and they pull out this grim, sort of gruesome mass of decomposing flesh, a horrible thing, still in a wetsuit, minus its head, minus its hands. They bring it ashore, they call the police, and then begins this inquest, which has to decide, is this or is this not the corpse of Lionel Crabb? And that in itself is an incredibly complex process. It involves the family are involved. And what's weird about this is one of the people brought in to identify this very hideous, very nasty sight is Margaret Crabb, who's the ex-wife, the divorced wife of Lionel Crabb. And she tells police that, yes, this is the body of Lionel Crabb. And she tells her friends that, no, it wasn't the body of Lionel Crabb. So yet again, there are there's so many stories that don't quite add up. And what we did, my producer, Sarah Peters, and I, we got one of the country's leading forensic pathologists to take us through the inquest, because we had all the papers of the inquest, take us through and work out whether this could or could not have been the corpse of Lionel Crabb. It should be said we had a remarkable discovery, because there are not that many papers in the National Archives about the Lionel Crabb mystery, because they're still being held onto by the Cabinet Office. But we'd spoken to an investigative reporter on The Guardian, Rob Evans, and he said, look, there's always stuff out there. You just have to, look, think laterally, go to unexpected places and look for stuff, which we did. And one of those places was Chichester Public Record Office, where we didn't expect to find anything. But we did. We struck gold because we found the entire police report into the Lionel Crabb affair that for some reason had never been transferred to the National Archives. And it had absolutely everything, all the witness statements. interviews, police interviews. The most grisly photographs of this rotting corpse were pulled out of Chichester Harbour. And so we had access to all this material, which was invaluable when we went to our forensic pathologist for him to guide us through how they would have tried to identify this corpse.
And do you think it was him in the end, or you're not sure?
So our forensic pathologist, Richard Shepherd, he concluded through a lot of very skillful and expertise that it 99.9% was Lionel Crabb.
Wow.
But that's not the end of the mystery, because the other unanswered question is, how the hell did this corpse end up in Chichester Harbour? Because he went missing in Portsmouth Harbour. So we called on the services of the country's leading forensic hydrologist, which is
didn't know there was one.
I didn't know that job existed. But Professor Carolyn Roberts is an absolute expert on how dead bodies move in water, with a particular speciality on rivers, estuaries, and tidal sort of areas. And she's solved numerous crimes for the police, working out, if a body's washed up, point A, where did it come from originally? And so she studies currents, tidal flows, all sorts of stuff like that. And we had an absolutely fascinating day with her. She was such a character. She talked remarkably sort of freely and matter-of-factly about, decomposing bodies that she'd examined, etc., etc. But she brought along all this incredible data about the flow of water between Portsmouth Harbour and Chichester Harbour, which, as I say, they're about 8 miles apart. And she concluded that it was absolutely impossible, literally impossible, for Lionel Crabb's corpse to have moved naturally from Portsmouth Harbour to Chichester Harbour. Part of the reason was to do with the tidal flows and everything, but also the water coming out of Chichester Harbour, the flow is a lot stronger, because obviously there's rivers coming into Chichester Harbour. The outflow is much, much stronger than the inflow. And so she concluded, particularly, it's all about the buoyancy of corpses. I mean, she got into this amazing detail, very grim detail, but absolutely fascinating, about gases in the body, the buoyancy of the body. Of course, Lionel Crabb was wearing oxygen cylinders, which are heavy. So yeah, her conclusion was, there's absolutely no way this body could have floated there naturally. And therefore, her conclusion was the body had to have been placed there. And then our next question was, by whom and why?
Wow.
So, the mystery, at every step, the mystery sort of deepened.
Could I ask you one? Can I just take you back to the beginning? Sorry to jump in. Oh, by the way, I really should say to people listening, this podcast is brilliant. It's everything that ours isn't. It's really professionally made. It's got music, proper editing. It's totally smooth, and I'm really jealous. But no, it's a great.
And it has Andrew features.
It also has Andrew.
That's
so
one good thing.
I feel really out of it. But no, it's a really good listen. But you mentioned about the politics. It's a big moment in the Cold War. Britain really wants it to go well. Eden is excited to have these top Soviets. So surely he wouldn't have authorized something as dangerous as sending down a diver to this ship. Do you think it could have been something that the leading people in government simply didn't know about? Or are there double and triple crosses going on here?
Yes, was it a rogue operation with deniable agents?
It's a great question, and this really gets to the heart of it, that Eden had been absolutely insistent, and he'd told MI6 that there were to be no dirty operations taking place. No, nothing is to happen during the visit. This is the stakes are just too high. And so, but clearly something did happen, and this led us to the conclusion that this was a rogue operation, absolutely carried out without Eden's knowledge, which is why he was so furious when he discovered that that there had been an operation had taken place. And so that begs the question: well, who on earth ordered this rogue operation? Where should we be pointing the finger of blame at this? So that was one strand that we looked into. There was another very interesting angle to this, is that Sarah, the producer, and I found the journalist who covered this story in 1956. Amazingly, Peter Marshall was a young journalist at the time, ran a news agency in Portsmouth, and he was covering this for pretty much all of the nationals at the time. A big story for him, and a big story being the arrival of Khrushchev and Bulganin, a story that got even bigger over the days that followed with Crabb's disappearance. And he said right from the beginning, there is a mystery figure lurking in the background of this story, and that it is believed that this mystery figure was American and almost certainly belonged to this, was a CIA agent. And so it became apparent from quite early on that actually this was quite probably a rogue operation, or almost certainly a rogue operation undertaken by MI6, but also with the input of the CIA. Now, the MI6, they would have hesitated anyway before trying an operation like this, when you've got, Khrushchev and Bulganin coming to Great Britain. They're going off to meet the Queen, for heaven's sake. You don't want anything to blow up when this is going on. But the CIA, we spoke to a former spy, intelligence officer, who said, well, the CIA wouldn't give a damn about, the Queen and the stakes for the British. If they wanted information about this Soviet ship, which is clearly what this operation is all about, this ship was equipped with new revolutionary state-of-the-art engines, and the British and Americans wanted to know more about these engines. If the Americans wanted this information, they would say, well, let's just do it anyway. And they would have encouraged MI6 to pull off a rogue operation without the knowledge of the authorities in Britain.
Oh, that's so interesting. That's really cool.
And that's why they use Crabb. But I mean, there's also a suggestion that Mountbatten may have known about it. I mean, he denied any knowledge, but in fact, his deputy in the naval staff said that actually he did know about it.
Yes, I mean, we are almost certain, and obviously your expertise was invaluable in the podcast, Andrew, because Lord Mountbatten probably better than anyone, that we think it's almost certain that Mountbatten was involved. Like you say, this was a man who'd been involved in special operations during the war. He was a man who had torn up the rule book. He loved maverick operations, dirty tricks, guerrilla sabotage, anything like that. This was Mountbatten's territory. And he was also head of the Navy, of course, at this point. So it's very likely that Mountbatten was actually behind this. Always would be deniable. There was no paper trail. We could find no paper trail whatsoever. And I know you know the Mountbatten papers better than anyone else. You've never found anything. But how these things worked, they worked sort of on the quiet. Mountbatten would have chatted to somebody in his gentleman's club in Pall Mall and given the nod to this, and then it would have gone to MI6. There were plenty of people in MI6 who were very prepared to carry off a rogue operation like this, and we point the finger of blame at Nicholas Elliott, who was famous for liking underhand operations. He almost certainly had a hand in this, in Lionel Crabb's dive. And the choice of Lionel Crabb as well is interesting. This had to be somebody, it was an operation that had to be deniable, and that they had to use somebody who could be deniable. Lionel Crabb was retired by 1956. He was off the official books. So there could be no linkage between him and MI6. It was a sort of the ultimate deniable operation. So yeah, in the sort of hierarchy of things, we think that Mountbatten ordered the operation. He got Nicholas Elliott of MI6 to plan the operation, and Nicholas Elliott got Lionel Crabb to undertake the operation. That's the way we're pretty sure that it worked.
And Crabb comes across in your account as somebody whose kind of better days are behind him, really. He'd had this rather glamorous war, but it's sort of fallen on hard times. I mean, but was he in some senses wanting to get back into the game, or was he being exploited perhaps for one final kind of
This is the great tragedy of the whole story, I think, is that Crabb, as you say, by 1956, he was a vulnerable individual. So his best days were definitely behind him. His wartime heroics, were a thing of the past. And his world revolved around his diving buddies in Portsmouth. He lived down there. These were his drinking mates. He was a heavy drinker, was forever going to the pub and, knocking back 7 or 8 pints of an evening. He was, by 1956, he'd been retired from the Navy. And I think this was a terrible blow to lose that connection, which was his life. You know, he lived with these people. He loved that life. And by 1956, he was a broken man. He was virtually an alcoholic. He was a chain smoker. He was extremely unfit. He was absolutely the last person that should ever have been sent on this highly sensitive and highly risky operation. It should be said, because we spoke to naval divers, a very elderly one called Commander Julian Malik, who was absolutely fascinating because he'd done a lot of diving in Portsmouth Harbour. He said it's an extremely treacherous place to dive because not only have you got these swirling tidal currents and everything, which make it very difficult to negotiate underwater, but also it's full of mud. You can't see a thing down there. It's freezing cold. And, you know, you have to be absolutely top of your game. So for Nicholas Elliott, because Nicholas Elliott of MI6 needed someone deniable to do this operation, he chose Lionel Crabb. But in doing so, he knew he was choosing a vulnerable, unfit, chain-smoking alcoholic who should never have gone down underwater. And the night before the dive, what did Lionel Crabb do? He was back in Portsmouth, back with his old mates. He goes to the pub, drinks 8 pints of beer, and he's almost certainly still drunk when he goes out at dawn on the 19th of April and undertakes this dive. It's a tragic story, really.
Because he goes with someone else, but someone else remains, you know, above water while he goes down, doesn't he?
Yes, I knew very little about sort of diving. I've never been diving myself. So when we were interviewed, in fact, the very first interview we did was with Commander Julian Malik, who I met by chance, this Royal Navy diver. And I was talking to him because I'd long been fascinated by the story of Lionel Crabb, and I'd actually written about it many years ago. I did a book called Fascinating Footnotes from History, and it was just little snippets of curious stories. And I included the mystery of Lionel Crabb, but I could never really find out anything more about it. And I was at a dinner, and I found myself sitting next to Commander Julian Malik, and he told me he was an ex-Royal Navy diver based in Portsmouth. And I said, "You don't by any chance know about the Lionel Crabb mystery, do you?" And he said, "Well, actually, yes, I do, because I knew Frankie Franklin. Frankie Franklin was Lionel Crabb's diving buddy, because when you go diving, there's always two people. There's generally one who goes underwater and one who stays on the surface. And that morning, when Lionel Crabb slipped into the water to go diving underneath Khrushchev's vessel, Frankie Franklin is on the surface monitoring this dive, timing it. He knows. This is primitive diving. You know, this is 1956. The oxygen tanks were small. You had very limited time underwater. Lionel Crabb has precisely 1 hour to carry out this mission. If he's not back after 1 hour, something seriously bad has happened to him. So Frankie Franklin described to the chap I met, Julian Malik, he described being on the surface, looking at his watch, 50 minutes, 55 minutes, no sign of Lionel Crabb, 57, 58 minutes. He's beginning to get really worried. And then the hour passes and he realizes, you know, but after an hour and 10 minutes, that Lionel Crabb is not coming back. And this is the point at which really all hell breaks loose, because Frankie Franklin has to go back to his base, the Royal Navy base in Portsmouth, and tell his commanders, Lionel Crabb has just undertaken a top secret mission, rogue mission, and he's gone missing. And it's like this sort of, you could almost feel the sense of dread as this story, then it goes up to Whitehall, it goes to the Admiralty, and everyone was thinking, oh my God, this is very bad news indeed, because this is a celebrated, wartime hero who's gone missing. It's going to be a big news story. And it was. And when we first started, I talked about Anthony Eden making this speech in the House of Commons, which does not shut down the story, it opens up the story. So before you know it, you have this as front page news on in all the newspapers.
Because they went in and they ripped off the sort of visitors book or the hotel register, didn't they? Which of course raised more suspicions. It was a sort of cack-handed cover-up, really.
It's extraordinarily inept, and it does make you wonder how how good MI6 actually are or were in those days. Anyway, because what happened is that Lionel Crabb came down to Portsmouth, and he obviously needed somewhere to stay, so he stayed in a place called the Sallyport Hotel. And he checked in with another person. This is the mystery American called Bernard Smith. And bizarrely, this is extraordinary, actually, they both wrote their actual names into the visitor's book. And so when Lionel Crabb went missing, Peter Marshall, the 90-year-old journalist we interviewed, was sent down there. But the Times got wind of this story quite early on. And the Times said to Peter Marshall, can you go down to the Sallyport Hotel, go and check the visitor's book, see what's in there? So Peter Marshall goes down, he looks in the visitor's book, and he sees this page with the names Lionel Crabb and Bernard Smith written on the page in the visitor's book. He goes back to his offices, phones the Times, and says, yeah, their names are there. Lionel Crabb's name is there with another chap called Bernard Smith. And the Times correspondent says, get back down there, take a photographer back down there. We need a photo of that page of the visitor's book saying that Lionel Crabb was staying there that night. So Peter Marshall, he gets a photographer. He rushes back to the Sallyport Hotel, goes into the hotel entrance, gets a visitor's book, opens it up to take the photo, and the page is missing. It's been torn out.
Oh, wow.
And it's been torn out by a local police officer who actually, this is what's the most extraordinary thing, leaves a note saying, Jack Lamport, have torn out this page on the orders of X, And so, which is, I mean, you can't really make that up. It's just extraordinary, basically. And so, that at that point as well, that's another point at which the story, takes another angle as well. And it happens that the Times journalist who was so interested in this story is actually writing the wartime biography of Lionel Crabb. So he knows Lionel Crabb very well. And he really sort of leads the story, the reporting for the Times.
And was there anything in the States? I mean, if there was a CIA connection, there may have been papers there, or in Crest, which is the CIA archive.
Yeah, I tried to get information from the States. There is stuff in the archives, but it's not accessible. I tried to trace former CIA officers from the 1950s in the hope there'd be someone alive and who might be prepared to talk. I put adverts in there. They have a local. That you actually advised me to do this, Andrew.
In intelligence magazines, which is a great way of getting stuff.
Yes, unfortunately, no one answered or responded to that. And I think it's absolutely intriguing, the CIA angle. And the intelligence officer, now retired, that we interviewed, Michael Smith, who's actually is an expert on links between MI6 and CIA and has just written a book about it. He said to us it was very likely that MI6 and CIA would have been working together. They worked together closely, particularly in the mid to late 50s. So it was very, very plausible and credible that this was a joint operation.
And I mean, you talk about the body disappearing for a year. I mean, you do have some very interesting material on the fact that it may have been taken to an MI6 training centre.
Yes, so just outside Portsmouth Harbour, on the coast, on the coastal front, there is a top secret base called Fort Monkton. And Fort Monkton, if you try to approach it from the land side, you can't get anywhere near the place. It's surrounded by, endless barbed wire fences and all sorts of defences, CCTV cameras, absolutely everywhere. But Sarah and I wanted to get near this place and try and find out more about it, because whenever we talk to people, local people in Portsmouth, they said, oh, there's always been rumours of a connection with Fort Monkton. So we took a boat out and we got as near as we could from the sea to look at Fort Monkton. And it's an extraordinary place. It is bristling with barbed wire, with security fences, from the sea as well. There's an observation tower. And the owner of the boat, the captain who took us out there, he said, oh, look, they're up there right now. They're watching us. They want to know what we're doing here. He said, we can't get any closer than 50 meters from the shoreline. And they're watching us right now through binoculars. They want to know what we're doing here. Anyway, we did a bit of digging into this Fort Monkton, and it turns out it is an MI6 training establishment. And indeed, what we discovered, and which is in the podcast, is that Lionel Crabb's corpse was indeed recovered by MI6 divers and was taken to to Fort Monkton. And we have the most extraordinary interview in the last episode. I probably shouldn't give too much away, really, but with this 97-year-old lady called Mary Julie, who had a very, very interesting story and evidence that she told us as to what happened.
And you think
But
it
why
was,
would
there for,
MI6?
it was there for a year before it was then somehow relocated to Chichester?
Yeah, but why do that? And why cut off head and I mean, why not make it identifiable? Why not just dispose the body? Why put it back in the water?
Okay, so this is another example of the ineptitude of MI6. We believe that they wanted it to be discovered, they wanted the identity to be known, they wanted to shut the story down eventually. They had to wait for this whole thing to die down, they had to wait for Khrushchev to go back to the Soviet Union, but eventually they wanted to release the body would be discovered, and it would be sort of case closed. So we believe that they held the body and eventually released it into Chichester Harbour. But unfortunately, and we really had a lot of help and guidance here from our forensic pathologist, Dr. Richard Shepherd. Lionel Crabb was wearing a rubber wetsuit, but it had a gap between the headpiece and the body piece. And Richard Shepherd said, anybody that's in the sea for that long, it will get attacked by shrimps and crabs and aquatic creatures. And they will attack anywhere where there's a gap between the rubber. I mean, he's seen this happen in the past, you know. So the natural place for these aquatic animals to start nibbling away at the flesh is the gap between the neck where the headpiece met the body piece, so there was a gap at the neckline, and there was also a gap at the wrists, where the gloves met the main part of the bodysuit. And so he said it was actually not that surprising that a body that's been in the water for that long actually would lose its head and hand. That's the natural weakness. It's where the predators would get in and nibble away. And it should be said that there is actually, we didn't put this in the podcast because it was quite complicated, and already it's a complicated story. So we had to be quite careful about editing this story down to make it, manageable for the listener. But in fact, the body had been found some months earlier by another fisherman who had pulled it out of the water, and as he pulled it out, the head had fallen off. So and it slipped back into the water, and all he got actually was the lead weights, which came away from the body, and those lead weights were exactly the weights that Lionel Crabb was wearing on the day of his dive in Portsmouth Harbour.
And why put it in Chichester Harbour? Why not take it back to Portsmouth?
Because they definitely did not want Crabb's disappearance to be associated with Portsmouth. This was a highly embarrassing incident. The governments had to apologize to the Soviet authorities, etc. They didn't want any association between Lionel Crabb and Khrushchev's visit. So it's much easier. They'd already put out a cover story that Lionel Crabb drowned while doing Royal Navy tests in Stokes Bay. So, another place which is not Portsmouth Harbour. So they claimed, well, he drowned in Stokes Bay and the body was then washed into Chichester Harbour, which, in the 1950s, the science of forensic hydrology didn't exist. So really it was sort of no one was ever going to question this. It was only natural that his body would have, washed up eventually in Chichester Harbour. What those MI6 operatives didn't reckon on is that, in 2023, we have incredible science surrounding the movement of corpses in water. And we have people like Professor Carolyn Roberts, who was able to say to us, without a shadow of a doubt, that this body could not have moved naturally. And I have to say, only yesterday, one of the great interviewees we had on the podcast, one of my favorite, was Kerry McKinnon. Kerry McKinnon lived in Chichester, and he was a young boy at the time, and his family had a pleasure yacht. And they were out pleasure yachting in Chichester Harbour on the day when they're having their lunch on this yacht, and suddenly they hear a helicopter. This is very rare in the 1950s for a helicopter to fly overhead. They think, what the hell's going on? There's sudden commotion, and there seems to be lots of boats and everything. And actually, Kerry McKinnon was witness to the corpse being pulled out of the water. So he was actually there on that day. So he made a fascinating interview, and he remembered the day very well, and he actually had the visitor's book from the family yacht, which they recorded a headless frogman being pulled from Chichester Harbour. Anyway, I spoke to him yesterday because it was quite he had a few other things to tell us. And he'd worked with the Coast Guard for many years, and all his friends are knocking around in the Coast Guard, you search and rescue. And so they'd all been listening to the podcast, and they have all this monitoring equipment as well about bodies moving in water, because that's what they're doing, search and rescue. And so they ran all the data through their programs to see if Crabb's body could have been washed either from Portsmouth Harbour or from Stokes Bay into Chichester Harbour. And all their monitoring also showed, like our expert Caroline Roberts, that it was absolutely impossible for the corpse to have washed there naturally.
Gosh, I'd love to talk to Caroline Roberts.
We have 3 minutes left, just to say, and I want to ask one question, which you may not want to answer, because I know you're holding on for the end of your podcast. But you must expect the question, which is, your best guess. An accident? Did somebody really cut his throat? What do you actually think of? But perhaps we'll never know until these documents are released.
What is fascinating about this story is it's full of unreliable witnesses. And so we, one by one, we sort of go through what appear on the surface to be very credible stories. And with the help of our experts, we basically take many of these stories to pieces. The truth about Lionel Crabb, I can reveal it. What we believe is he drowned while drunk, but that's not really the end of the story, because the story is really about the cover-up, what really happened, who was really involved, and of course, where Andrew was so great in the podcast was talking about why the government will not release the Lionel Crabb papers until 2057. This is absolutely extraordinary. I put in freedom of information requests to the Cabinet Office, they admitted they have the file, and they kept they kept brushing me off. They're saying, we need more time to consider, we need more time to consider. I'm sure, Andrew, you've been down this route many, many times. They just basically are blocking and blocking and blocking. And eventually, to my surprise, I did get an answer. They said, we will not release this file on grounds of national security, which is clearly completely absurd. This is something that happened in 1956. Pretty much everyone is dead. And that led us to assume that really this almost certainly involved somebody, a very considerable figure, and the obvious person, Lord Mountbatten. Lord Mountbatten, of course, very, very close to Prince Charles and now King Charles. And it's embarrassing for the royal family, and anything that touches on the royal family that has a whiff of scandal about it, they'll simply shut that file away and you're never going to see it.
Wow. Well, what a story. And thank you for sharing it. One final question, Andrew. We've got a minute.
Well, this is also a wider story about the culture of secrecy. What is the future for historians if things are going to be blocked like this? What can we do?
It's very, very worrying. And I know you've been a champion, a crusader, and, I take my hat off to you, because it's very worrying. The culture of secrecy in this country is it's getting worse and worse. This current government is absolutely notorious for, withholding documents. And it makes the work for people like Andrew and I, historians, researching and writing books on sensitive subjects, it makes our job extremely difficult. There has to be a complete change. Much more documentation has to be placed into the public domain.
Well, amen to that. And thank you for the lesson in making proper podcasts.
And a great investigation, really
Indeed.
Interesting. It'd be fascinating to see what emerges after the podcast, which I hear is in the top 10.
It's been doing very well. Oh, of course, all down to your contribution, Andrew.
Now you need to do it for us, Andrew. Brilliant.
Subject.
Thank you.
Thanks
See you, Giles.
Brilliant.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to the Scandal Mongers podcast. This has been a Podcast World production. You can get in contact with our show by emailing team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandal Mongers in the heading, or via our social media links within the show's bio.